All right. Good afternoon, everyone. Thank you for joining us. My name is Kristie Puckett-Williams, and I'm the Deputy Director for Engagement and Mobilization at the ACLU of North Carolina. And we are continuing our community conversations today. And today we're going to focus on the living conditions and isolation in North Carolina prisons. And we'll also talk about, similar conditions that exist in jails as well. And again, this series is a part of the third annual Vigil for Freedom and Racial Justice. The Vigil for Freedom and Racial Justice is made up of a broad coalition of North Carolinians who are calling for justice, fairness, and second chances for people incarcerated in our state prisons and in our jails, and especially Black people and other people of color. Again, our campaign is in its third year and is partially focused on a small, regularly rotating group of people and organizations standing vigil outside of the governor's mansion in Raleigh. And since our primary demand is that Governor Cooper exercises clemency power, that is why we stand in vigil outside of his residence. And as part of the vigil this year, again, we are hosting a series of community conversations featuring North Carolina-based advocates fighting for freedom and racial justice in our state and educating their community on the ongoing harms of the modern day carceral state. Again, today's conversation is going to be a heavy conversation because we're going to be talking about the living conditions and the isolation that people experience here in North Carolina. I am joined today by some amazing people doing some amazing work around the conditions of incarceration here in North Carolina. I'm joined today by Erika Bowman, Drew Dahl, and Craig Waleed. And I'm gonna briefly go through their bios, and then we're going to, just to give y'all a run of show of what we're gonna see. We're gonna hear from Erika Bowman. You'll hear a little bit from me about the efforts to improve the living conditions of North Carolina prisons. You're gonna hear from Drew about the harms of solitary, and from Dr. Craig Waleed about the campaign to end solidarity in North Carolina. And again, we'll hear from Erika in just a moment about living conditions and reentry during the pandemic. Erika is the Hope Rising Coordinator for the Hope Coalition based in Henderson County. She works over youth programming in that role, and the Hope Coalition specializes in serving those who battle with or have been affected by a substance use disorder, and they provide services that specialize in 4 sections: prevention, education, advocacy, and recovery. Ms. Bowman teaches classes in a trauma-informed manner to serve those in reentry and recovery, and also provide one-on-one support. She is also a peer support specialist. Ms. Bowman has worked with Goodwill and their reentry team and the YWCA of Asheville, where she created their Light A Path program that provides trauma-sensitive program to underserved populations in prison, detention centers, and recovery centers. Thank you so much, Erika. As a person who is in recovery myself, I appreciate all that you do for our community. And next, we have Drew Dahl, who coordinates the reentry ministry of the Religious Coalition for a Nonviolent Durham. And in that role, he recruits, trains, and supports volunteers to sit in a circle with individuals exiting incarceration. He also works one-on-one with folks returning from prison. He has over 30 years of experience in the military and a Marine Corps. I think that's what this says. Yes, he has over 30 experience in the U.S. Marine Corps, public accounting and business, and spent nearly 4 years in state prison due to a conviction for embezzlement. Following prison, Drew determined to make a positive impact on the community and now works with nonprofits focused on improving the lives of the economically and socially disadvantaged. Drew, thank you for sharing your experience and strength and hope with us today. And our final panelist is Dr. Craig Waleed, and he serves as project manager for Disability Rights North Carolina, Unlock the Box campaign against solitary confinement and end solitary NC. Craig is an educator, a counselor, a certified restorative practices group facilitator, author, motivational speaker, and he is dedicated to excellence in teaching, scholarship, and disrupting the community to prison pipeline. Thank you so much to all of you all for joining us today. Again, my name is Kristie Puckett-Williams. We're going to be talking about living conditions inside of prisons and jails here in North Carolina. And Erika, Ms. Bowman, are you ready to go ahead? I'm gonna turn it over to you for the next few minutes to hear more about living conditions and reentry during the pandemic.
I am, and I just wanna start off by expressing my gratitude for having the opportunity to even be a part of this community conversation. So I was incarcerated through the pandemic, prior to, through it, and then released during the pandemic, in 2021, April of 2021. So being in there and the panic that goes on. And of course, no one stepping into the pandemic knew how to navigate that. And being in there, there's the isolation piece that we're going to hear more about. And then the fear of not knowing what's going on with your families, of shutting down the news so you can't see what's going on in the world, and combating all of that. So you have the hysteria that goes along with that. And then coming home through that. So you're isolated, you're panicked, you don't really know what's going on in the free world. And then you come home to a lack of resources. So you have all of these restrictions. And to an extent, coming home from an institution that made it easier because only so many people are allowed. You have to stand in line a certain way. You have to space a certain way. So coming home from an institution that made transition a little easier. However, when you're looking at the mental health resources, the food resources, I personally have Class F trafficking charges. So in the state of North Carolina, I cannot get food stamps, any type of Medicaid. So that creates another barrier. So coming home, it was really rough in knowing and coming to a new area. I'm not from the Buncombe County area. I now live in Henderson County. So how do you get counseling? And then you don't have insurance, you don't have employment, and you're trying to figure out how to navigate this to stay whole in your recovery and to stay whole to the person that you created through that. So you leave incarceration a different person, and then you come home. And I started a lot of work in reentry. So I was over 4 counties with Goodwill's Project Reentry. And the lack of resources in certain areas, especially when it comes to mental health support, and knowing that you're not alone. So we lean very heavily on peer supports and going through that transition. And it's needed. So you're alone. You go from being surrounded by hundreds of people. And like the part of transition that was hardest for me coming home is you're isolated in there, but you're isolated with people. So you're surrounded by hundreds to thousands of people, and then you're not prepared for being in your head alone. The hardest part of my transition personally in my life was, okay, you start building sustainable equity, you're stable, but you don't know how to be alone in your own head, and you don't have the resources of people to turn to. So we're isolating people, which creates a whole nother set of trauma. Then you're sent home. So there's no preparation in our reentry and coming home and how to prepare for that. What are the resources? Where are you living? How do you have counseling resources? What are the recovery resources in your area? And we're handing out, these packets and red folders that are pre-pandemic. So you don't even know if half of these resources are working, and then you're told you're not meeting these needs. So specifically in our area in the Western District, we are able to use community health workers and really building upon some of these resources. But how are we getting that information to the people coming home? Like, that's a big piece. So you're isolated, you come home through the pandemic, and then you're stuck trying to figure out what's the next thing and where do you get support and how do we combat that, and allowing people not to turn into the unhealthy coping mechanisms or the criminal lifestyles that we're familiar with and we know how to navigate. So we know how to live in that world. But coming home, we need support to be able to do this. So that's a big piece of the work that I do, and being able to provide support for people in transition who are new to recovery or who are new to civilian life, and they're trying to live this in a different form than the criminal lifestyle we're used to. And getting those resources to people are huge. But if anyone has any questions or would like for me to follow up with anything, please let me know, but I will hand that off now.
Thank you so much. And people will put questions in the chat, and we'll have some discussion questions at the end. And so we'll make sure those questions get to you. So Thank you so much, Erika, for sharing again your experience, strength, and hope. And just like recovery is a journey, as you know, so is reentry. So welcome home, and let us know if there's anything we can do to support that process. And so now I'm going to talk a little bit about living conditions of North Carolina prisons, insights that we have from the many prison tours that we've done, also the research that we've done around the conditions of incarceration for people who are pregnant. Being someone who's formerly incarcerated, I've had my fair share of experience inside of carceral spaces. When I talk about carceral spaces, I'm talking about jails, prisons, treatment centers, shelters, places that are run just like prisons. So oftentimes in community, the interventions that we have in place for people oftentimes are carceral, just like the jails and the prisons that people are trying to avoid. So things like when to come in, when to get up, chore lists, all these things that don't promote personal decision-making and autonomy. And so the conditions inside of carceral spaces, because of the lack of autonomy that people have, can be, quite dehumanizing, demoralizing, and demeaning. And so I have had the privilege of going on tours with elected officials, which is different than being on the inside yourself. And so recently we were able to go visit a work farm in Eastern North Carolina, and we were able to talk to folks who were currently incarcerated, look at the tablets that they were using, look at the spaces that they were relegated to, look at solitary confinement at that prison, and just really, really delve down into what the conditions were like. And what we know from our tours is based on custody level, the conditions inside of a prison can be very different. So you have, the correctional, the close custody camps, the close custody, which is like maximum security. When you go to those prisons, you can't really get up close to them. There's lots of barbed wire, fencing. The buildings are a little taller. They kind of look like tall office buildings almost, but you can just tell by the little windows that it's a carceral space. But as you get more into the medium and minimum custody, you see more dormitory style living quarters, more people having more access to other people. So based on your custody level can also dictate how much interaction or how little interaction you have with other people, and also how many privileges or lack of privileges or access to privileges that you have. Folks who are in lesser custody levels, who have lower custody levels, have access to more activities, programming, and all types of things. And so people who are deemed to be quote unquote violent or dangerous oftentimes are kept in isolation or separate from other folks, which we know continues to promote that violence and does not promote connectivity and promotes disconnectivity. But most of my work focuses on the nuances of the conditions of incarceration. So yes, we know that generally the conditions of incarceration are horrible, but they are especially nuanced and different when we talk about the incarceration of women and girls, because jails and prisons were not made with women and girls in mind. And so women and girls are oftentimes treated like an ad hoc to the system, meaning that they are just placed in that system and expected to exist in that space with or without accommodation. And so when we work on our policies here in the state of North Carolina, we try, on my team, we really try to think about the conditions of incarceration for the most marginalized inside of those spaces. And that's going to be women and girls, especially Black women, especially Black trans women, and especially pregnant people of any race. And so when we drill even further down from not just from the incarceration of women and girls, but get even further down into the incarceration of pregnant women and girls, we can see that pregnant folks have a really, really horrible experience of incarceration. As some of you all know, I was incarcerated while pregnant and I received no prenatal care. And the lack of care is just one issue that pregnant folks face while incarcerated. A lot of them face the same challenges and are kept in close custody for safety reasons. And so they experience solitary-like conditions to ensure their safety inside of the spaces, rather than them be released and go home and be able to spend time in community to be pregnant. When they are relegated to spaces, they are relegated to spaces that are have limited contact with other people who are incarcerated as a safety measure. And so when we began to work on ending the shackling of pregnant women, we knew that shackling wasn't the only thing that the challenges that pregnant people who were incarcerated were facing. They were being routinely strip searched. They will be having cavity searches, which y'all, cavity searches is just what it sounds like, having your orifices checked for contraband after visits. Women, all people experience that, men, women, everyone. But it is especially demeaning for pregnant women and women just in general to be strip searched and have cavity searches, oftentimes by male officers. Women were shackled to the bed while in labor, having male officers pregnant having male officers present in the room while they were pushing and delivering, not being able to bond with their babies, as well as having nutritional challenges, meaning not getting enough food to eat while they were pregnant. And so we worked on, again, changing the conditions of incarceration for pregnant people by getting House Bill 608 passed. And House Bill 608 limit the use of restraints during the second and third trimesters, during labor and delivery, and throughout the first 6 weeks of postpartum. We limited invasive searches of pregnant or postpartum women who are incarcerated. We limited the use of restrictive housing, solitary confinement, for incarcerated women who are pregnant in the first 6 weeks postpartum. And we required the Department of Public Safety to allow a newborn baby to remain in the mother's care for at least 72 hours. We required DPS to provide menstrual products for all incarcerated people with an active menstrual cycle. And so that's some of the efforts that we have engaged in our coalitions to try to make sure that the conditions of incarceration are a little bit better for folks, but especially for women and girls. And with that, I'm going to call Mr. Dahl to the floor for you to talk about just how harmful solitary confinement is. Mr. Dahl, thank you so much.
Hey, thanks for having me today. I spent 15 months in what the state of North Carolina calls administrative seg. The rest of the world would call solitary. Your first 24, 48 hours in solitary is so extraordinarily stressful, literally bouncing off the walls. Because your cell, at least mine was, I could walk 4 steps lengthwise, 3 steps sideways. And that was it. And you realize over the period of time, the longer you're in there, we talk about that prison is tough because you don't have the opportunity to make many decisions. And then when you come home, you have a lot of decisions to make. Well, in solitary, you really don't make any decisions. All of that's taken away from you. Can you turn your lights on or off? No, somebody controls your lights. Somebody controls when you eat, what you eat. You don't have any choices at all in that. You have half hour a day, at least I did, to go out and take a shower. However, they put handcuffs on you when you go out to take a shower. So showering wearing handcuffs is an experience. Over time, the longer solitary goes, the harder it is to have any motivation to do anything, because every day, every moment becomes just the same. When I first went into solitary, I could figure out what day of the week it was because from my window, I could see across the fence and I could see a church. And so I could see on Sunday mornings, people were going to church. And so I knew that was Sunday, because you don't get TV, you don't get paper, you don't get anything. You don't know what day it is, but I could figure out Sunday. Well, at some point, the superintendent decided that being able to see outside was too much of a privilege, and they painted over our windows. And so from that point on, I had no idea what day it was. And the terrifying thing was to realize that other than bringing around medicine once a day or twice a day and feeding us 3 times a day, no one came in to check on us. You could have a heart attack, you could have a seizure, you could be in really bad shape, and no one's going to see you. And even if they do, they're not really going to care. This idea that you have been completely abandoned and isolated is terrifying and dehumanizing, and eventually you get to the point that you just lay on your bunk all day. because there's nothing else to do. That goes a long way towards explaining why when less than 10% of our incarcerated folks in the US are in solitary, but half of our suicides while people are incarcerated are from folks that have been in solitary. And even if, for those who don't commit suicide, there are long-term mental health issues. The longer you're in solitary, and the interesting thing is, there was a study done by Dr. Stuart Grasson, and he found that after 30 days of solitary, kind of psychological effects set in that pretty much lasts the rest of your life. Difficulty making decisions, panic attacks, an inability to tolerate kind of normal sounds and experiences. I see this a lot. I work with a ton of guys who are coming home, and men and women who have spent significant time in segregation really struggle just to make basic decisions, because that's been taken away from you for so long that your brain just kind of adjusts to not making decisions. And so we impose these, even for people who survive the experience, we impose lifelong mental health issues. And on top of that, we also add physical health issues. If you have diabetes or high blood pressure or heart disease, the lack of exercise and the lack of medical care, because at least in my experience, I have diabetes and heart disease both. I didn't see a doctor the entire time I was in segregation. Never seemed to work out. I'd ask, I'd say, hey, I'm supposed to see a cardiologist. I really need to see a doctor about blood pressure, or no one's been monitoring my blood sugar. No response at all, because frankly, nobody cares. And you're in solitary, you're not having any exposure, you don't have any phone calls, you don't have any way to reach the outside world. So the prison system really isn't worried about you, because why should they be? You have no ability to complain. And even if you did, well, that person's in solitary. They're an administrative seg. They're there for a reason. So we create within the class of people that we say are incarcerated, and then for the rest of their lives, treat them as if they're lepers. We have a special subclass even within that. Folks that we stuck in solitary, that while they're in solitary are largely ignored, untreated, uncared for. And doing that imposes on them lifelong mental and physical health consequences. So anyway, I'll ask questions and I'll be glad to answer them later.
Thank you so much, Drew. That was so insightful. And I just want to name that we're talking about the state of North Carolina and jails and prisons here in North Carolina, but also in the federal system. There are people who are relegated to solitary confinement, people who, whether in their U.S. penitentiary, but there are even amongst the U.S. penitentiaries, there are those that are known as supermax, meaning that those folks are in solitary confinement every single day that they are in that facility. Every cell is a solitary cell. There's not anybody inside of supermaxes who are not considered to be on solitary confinement. Their cells are soundproofed. They are moved one at a time. They bring the shower to the cell, y'all. It's a mobile shower that they roll down to the cell. People have to put their hands through the trap, put the shackles on, then they allow them to take a shower right at their door. There's very minimal movement. It is really, really, really insane at the federal level, but it's also just as torturous at the state level. So now we're going to hear from Dr. Waleed, who's going to talk to us about the campaign to end solitary confinement that is happening right now here in North Carolina. Thank you, Dr. Waleed.
Thank you, Kristie. And I want to say thank you for having me be a participant in this discussion today. And so, yeah, I want to talk about solitary confinement, but I also want to first share that I spent 8 years in New York State's prisons, and I did 2 30-day stints in solitary confinement. And just what these folks are talking about is very accurate according to my experiences. Before I move on, can you folks see my PowerPoint?
Yes, we can.
Very well. So I'm going to start it. I don't know. Here we go. So solitary confinement, as you've heard folks talk about, it's a restrictive place. It's a very small place. It's a very small room. Kristie and Drew and Erika have already talked about isolation. It's where you're in isolation most of the day. You might get an hour, or the person might get an hour out of the cell. Drew talked about the lack of stimulation. I think so did Erika. But we think about human beings not being able to be stimulated by the environment or by other people. It leads to a deterioration of one's cognitive abilities. Solitary confinement is oftentimes called various names, like restrictive housing or ADSEG or the hole or protective custody. But at the end of the day, people are isolated from each other. And so our campaign and many others across the state, and maybe even in different parts of the world, are looking at solitary confinement as a means of torture. And according to the Mandela Rules, which is the United Nations demand for fair treatment of incarcerated people, anything over 15 days within a 60-day period inside solitary confinement is considered torture. And so this is a picture of what a solitary confinement cell might look like, give or take. But just imagine living, say, in a bathroom, a typical bathroom with a sink, a toilet, and a bunk. Remove your tub in your shower, and that's where the bunk would go. And imagine living in there with a solid door, with a slot and a very small window, the slot where you get your food served to you, and the window, which is oftentimes barbed or tinted or blacked out, so you really can't see anything. There's lack of sunlight. There's lack of, again, stimulation. Some people are in solitary so long, as Kristie talked about, especially in the super maxes, that they don't even have the opportunity to experience stepping on grass or experiencing the sunlight. So it's a very dehumanizing experience that causes the development, as Drew talked about, of psychosis and other physiological harms or damage. So when people are allowed outside of the cell, as Kristie talked about, you know, the shower is sometimes brought right to them. And so they may have to shower with shackles on. And these shackles definitely limit the movement of one's hands. And so just imagine not being able to adequately wash your body. Just imagine being manacled, period. It's very dehumanizing. But when folks are not going to the shower, and if they get an opportunity to get out of the solitary confinement cell, they may be allowed inside of another cage that's indoors or outdoors. And they pretty much represent a dog's kennel. The ones outdoors, I've spent time in, but I felt so dehumanized that during my time in solitary confinement, I refused to go out because I did not want to be in this dog's kennel. But people are placed in these cages for maybe an hour, and that's considered time out of the cell. Folks are typically inside of solitary confinement cells for 22 to 24 hours. The mandates in most states and federal prisons is that they are supposed to get out for 1 hour of recreation 5 times a week. But that's prison, and prisons are these independent fiefdoms that really only answer to few, and the few that they answer to oftentimes green light whatever the prison officials deem as regular protocol. So they don't necessarily have to follow laws until you get agencies such as disability rights and other agencies who are for human rights breathing down their neck. And still there's lots of resistance. But at the end of the day, solitary confinement is a violation of the Equal Protection Clause of the 14th Amendment. And so people should be treated with fair and people should be treated fairly, and they should have no harm done to them, basically.
Greg, I want to pop in real quick and let you know, I think your PowerPoint froze. We aren't able to see anything you're sharing right now.
No?
So we can see your screen, but you need to move to the next slide, whichever one you're on.
Yeah, I've been moving.
Oh, well, yeah, it's frozen.
Yeah.
Oh, wow. I'm not sure what I should do. Maybe stop sharing and then share again.
Yeah, like try to reset that. Yeah.
Okay. And then I'll go back in and share again. How about that? What do you see?
Much
Okay.
better. Good
We
job.
see-
Awesome.
Okay. So solitary, do you see this slide, the impact of solitary confinement?
Yes.
Yes.
Right on. All right. So again, I'm just reiterating what Erika mentioned, what Drew mentioned, which is that solitary confinement exacerbates mental health and physical health issues. I've been out of prison for over 25 years, but since I've been out of prison, I've developed a host of health challenges, heart disease, DVT, Crohn's. I'm grateful for having good health care. I'm grateful for science, because maybe I would have been dead a while ago. But there's a wide scientific consensus that all types of harms come from living or being involved in solitary confinement. And when I say living and involved, I'm also talking about even the people who work in these places. They have very similar mental and physical health outcomes to the people who are being kept in these environments. So it's a really dehumanizing experience. And so as I come up on the end of my discussion, I just want to point out that, people who spend time in solitary confinement are at increased rates of dying from suicide in the first year after release. And there's also a high rate of suicide amongst people who are inside solitary confinement. There's also an increased rate of people dying from homicide in their first year after release. And then there's what I call a super or hyper increased rate of people dying of opioid overdoses in the first 2 weeks after release. So how about that? Solitary confinement, there's nothing good about it, but some folks will advocate that it's necessary. And I think it's only necessary in very extreme cases. Otherwise, what it does is it debilitates the human being and makes it difficult for people to transition back into general population or back into the community, which ultimately becomes a human, should I say, a public health issue as well as a public safety issue. And probably even more things than I'm mentioning. And then lastly, our organization, I mentioned Disability Rights North Carolina. I'm part of the criminal justice team with Disability Rights North Carolina, and we have a coalition that we are calling In Solitary North Carolina. And we're focused on developing community awareness so that we can begin bringing about a tipping point strategy to get more support for anti-solitary confinement. And ultimately, what we want to do is, or what we're working on is figuring out the best way to convince or to, for lack of a better term, bully our current governor into honoring the recommendations that were made by his task force for racial equity in corrections, the TREC task force in 2019, who recommended that the Mandela rules be implemented in North Carolina's prisons, which again calls for people to be held no longer than 15 days in solitary confinement within a 60-day period, and anything over 15 days is considered torture. And so in closing, I want to encourage or invite folks to join us at the End Solitary North Carolina movement or campaign through Disability Rights North Carolina. I have some links there where you can go to Disability Rights, or you can email me directly. We meet monthly to discuss our strategies and planning, and we have been moving slowly, but we are moving and we're gaining ground. So every third Tuesday of the month. And so our next meeting is next week, Tuesday. I believe that is the 20th. If you are interested in joining or seeing what we're working on, please contact me. So thank you for your time. Thank you for your attention.
Thank you so much, Dr. Waleed, for again sharing your experience, strength, and hope with all of us. Thank you to all of the panelists who joined us today. And I think I'm going to turn it over to Tim to lead us through any questions that the audience may have or any just general discussion. Tim?
Thanks a lot, Kristie. Yeah, so you can see here, I guess to start us off, I know we have some questions in the chat we can read, but before I get to those, I want to have everyone think about this one main question we have of what are other efforts, what are the efforts in general to improve prison conditions or end solitary confinement? So first question we have one from Peter. The question is, solitary used as a way to control through intimidation in jails and prisons that are overcrowded or short-staffed? He has multiple questions, so I can stop there if our panelists want to pop in for that question initially. Is solitary used as a way to control through intimidation in prisons and jails that are overcrowded or short-staffed? And is there less use of it in cases where there's no overcrowding or sufficient staffing?
You know, I want to jump right in there. I'm looking at Peter's question, and based on my experience, I don't think I'm not sure if there's any research that supports this, but I do believe that solitary confinement in many regards is used to control folks through intimidation, because people dread going, for the most part, to solitary confinement. And oftentimes when we find folks in solitary confinement, there are probably overrepresentation of people who are in there with non-violent offenses within the prison facility. And then there's also an overrepresentation of people who are in solitary confinement who have psychological disorders. And so going in solitary confinement will only make their psychological disorders worse. And if they don't have them when they go in, oftentimes they come out with some.
Yeah, I absolutely agree. The only piece I'd take issue with is it's used more in overcrowding or short staffing environments. My experience would say they use it to intimidate regardless of whether they're adequately staffed or not, or whether there's more people than they can handle. They use it for intimidation and control, regardless.
And the last part of Peter's question, you know, we're kind of skipping over some of the things that he said, but this last piece is very, it's just poignant. And he said, it reminds me of the way slaves were transported, or captured Africans were transported over in crowded ships. Solitary is the slave ship of the present time, you know, and I think that's, I think that's very illustrative of what is happening or what continues to happen in prisons and jails.
Neil, I saw you have your hand raised. If you want to come off mute, feel free to share.
Yeah, I appreciate it. So I wanted to, I was just hoping to ask a question about the grievance process. What, you know, is it real? Is it the same if you're in solitary confinement or in general population? Just anything y'all can, any insights about the internal grievance process and whether it is actually, you know, can do anything?
I think it's a paper tiger, personally. I don't think that much comes out of the internal internal grievance process, because you're oftentimes, as an incarcerated person, appealing to the people who are incarcerating you to make your conditions better. As we know, prison conditions have not gotten better, and any changes that we have seen in prisons and jails have only come as a result of people on the outside advocating for the people who are incarcerated. That's my personal take. So again, I don't have any data to back that.
And in my personal experience, from my own 6 years that I served, I did not see much other than kind of like putting a target on yourself when you went through the grievance process. So you have other residents and staff members that get frustrated because staff members, if you're writing a grievance against them, they're told, they're informed. You don't really see anything come from the repercussions as a resident. And then you're also kind of tormented by staff members because they're pissed off that you went above them and stated that they weren't doing something. So by naming your truth, you became a target. In my personal experience.
Yeah, this is kind of a stupid example, but it illustrates I think the truth behind the grievance process. When I was at Johnson Correctional, I worked in the kitchen. We had a person file a grievance because they felt like that they weren't getting as many French fries as other folks. The response of the prison was to completely eliminate French fries from the menu. Anytime they came up, they just struck them out and substituted those fake mashed potatoes that you make from the flakes. And kind of the experience of that is filing a grievance or complaining never does anything positive for you. At the best, you lose something that's a fairly benign loss. At the worst, like Erika was saying, you put a target on your back to be a troublemaker. And once you're identified as that, you can, every day you can find a reason to charge someone with something.
In the federal system, we have been fighting for years, not for them to four-point the women when they're in segregation, and put them on the slab and handcuff them to the top and to the back. Their hands to the top and their feet to the bottom, naked. They would do that, women that way in segregation. And they did that in Florida when I was incarcerated in the federal system there. And that was a horrible experience for women. It messes their complete mind up until when they come out, they're suicidal.
And imagine, Grandma, thank you for that. Imagine the people who are suicidal, who then who are stripped butt naked, then placed in the turtle suit, the anti-suicide suit that they use, what we call the turtle suit, that green suit. And when that happens, they take your mattress out, they take all your sheets, they take everything out pretty much. And so you're placed in like these solitary-like conditions with no phone call. It's just solitary, butt naked, and with the anti-suicide suit on. And I just remember being extremely cold because I was in a pretrial. And I hadn't even threatened suicide. I just was being non-compliant with what the people had said. And they were like, you know what? We got something for you. And this was like, so they had something for me, which was cold, hungry, naked. And if I was really suicidal, I was always thinking that, damn, if I wanted to kill myself, this would speed that process up, because of like, damn, you cold, you hungry, you can't use the phone, you can't call nobody, you don't have access to commissary. You are just really, really treated for being mentally ill, for being like, even people with substance use disorders. I mean, the amount of deaths that we see inside of jails and prisons right now for overdoses, because staff just do not care when people self-identify or are already identified by police as having used, and do not care to administer Narcan to them. I heard Mr. Dahl talk about not receiving any care in general. And you would assume that, okay, people aren't receiving care, but maybe a pregnant person might receive some care. Even pregnant people now think about all these right to life people who outside the abortion clinics every day, fighting, right? saying that people have a right to life and human life is important, but those same people are okay and comfortable with mostly Black, brown, and 100% of the people who are incarcerated are underpaid, working class families, and they are okay with those families being placed in these carceral conditions that are dehumanizing, that are uncared for. And it's just always striking to me how we live in a Christian society that says love your neighbor, and people in prisons aren't your neighbor.
So think about this, if I could. I'm sorry to cut you off, Kristie.
No, go ahead.
You know, one of the things you keep saying, and I believe, is people in prison, people. But the thing is that people's humanity is ignored once they're in prison and jail. As we understand, the 13th Amendment talks about, you know, slavery exists for people who are incarcerated. And if we go back, we remember that people who were enslaved, their humanity was always ignored. And so we're not considered people once we're in prisons and jail. We're considered inmates. We're considered felons. We're considered anything but a person. And any harm, hurt, or danger that comes to us, the society has been conditioned to believe they deserve it.
And that's right. And that's why the rehumanization that we've been talking about through this entire process starts with the language, right? We have to acknowledge that these are not convicts, felons, or inmates. These are people. Now, they are prisoners. Right. Because if they could leave at their own will, they would. So they are prisoners now, but they are also people. And let's just be clear that all people in prison are political prisoners in these United States of America, y'all. Please understand that. All prisoners in these United States of America are considered political prisoners because of the political nature in which their identities, their poverty, and their experiences have been criminalized by this country. If you have questions or any comments, please, y'all, feel free to put them in the chat. So we can, I know Tim is going to have some polling that he's going to put up right at the very end. But I see something that just popped up in the chat. So it says, I wonder what it would take for the general society to question their assumptions about prison. I remember the uproar over how our military mistreated people in Iraq at Abu Ghraib. I think I'm saying that wrong, but I would also remind you, Peter, that there are currently people incarcerated at Guantanamo Bay who were routinely tortured, have never seen a judge, and have been there since 2000, after September 11th, right? And so, you know, the torture that the state of North Carolina participated in, if you go to our YouTube channel at the ACLU of North Carolina, we had an event, I want to say it was last year, on the use of torture and race in this state of North Carolina, and how we have participated in torture. But it's also funny to me how people don't make that connection to solitary confinement. That again, solitary confinement is considered torture by the World Health Organization. And there are 29,000 people inside of prisons today who are at risk for being tortured. And the conditions themselves, whether you're in solitary confinement or not, are torturous. Being disconnected and disappeared, not just from your humanity and your community, but from your family. You know, I think about, we don't often talk about this. Think about how not only can you not touch anybody else in prisons, you can't even touch yourself. If you touch you, that's an infraction. So like your ability to even control your own body, what you do with your own body, not just like where you go, and it's also touching, like just even a touch from another person is not allowed in carceral spaces. So that, again, that dehumanization goes down to not just them removing your name and identifying you by a number, but it goes down to the clothes, the quality of the food. Everything has been well thought out to remind a person that they are being punished. And so we as a community have to ask ourselves, are we looking for punishment, or are we looking for people to transform and change? And has punishment gotten us that transformation that we've been seeking for so long? So again, if you have any questions, please put them in the chat.
So people have been transformed. People are being transformed and changed, but it's for the negative. You know, I know what you're talking about. We're talking about people being rehabilitated or habilitated, but that's not happening. So, you know, it makes me wonder, you know, is this system really designed to help people or hurt people? What is the cause? What is the purpose? Because we know solitary confinement is not helping anyone.
Well, here at the Vigil for Freedom and Racial Justice, we know that the point and the purpose of prisons is to keep people in a subjugated and commodified state that disempowers them, that, that allows them to work for free for the state's profit, as it has always profited from enslaved and incarcerated people's labor. And we know that there's a real connection between the prison industrial complex and the intersections of money and prisons and enslavement. And so we will continue to have these conversations. Our next community conversation, y'all, is going to be next Tuesday. And we're going to be talking from housing crises to employment gaps. What are these barriers that people face when returning home? So why are we having this conversation? We talked a little bit about it today. You heard Erika talk about reentry. You heard me talk a little bit about reentry. I know you heard Drew talk about it. And so reentry, as well as Craig, reentry is when a person returns home. So at the Vigil for Freedom and Racial Justice, we want Governor Cooper to let our people go. But letting them go is not enough if they don't have nothing to come home to. So what does coming home look like? What does it mean for a person to come home and to have community and to be supported so that we actually do decarcerate and lower the rate of recidivism? So again, from housing crises to employment gaps, what are the barriers that people face when returning home? And again, as we always say at the Vigil for Freedom and Racial Justice, the vigil continues. The vigil never ends. So please join us. We're going to drop it in the chat, but visit www.decarceratenownc.com to learn more about the vigil. And please, if you have not already, sign on to our demand letter from Governor Cooper that is demanding, requiring, telling, forcing, running up on, whatever you want to call it, him to let our people go. We are no longer going to allow our people to exist in these states and for those states of torture not to be highlighted. And again, I'm going to turn it over to Tim right now because he's going to put up that closing poll. We want to get your answers to the poll. And again, we will see you next Tuesday. If you have not been out to the vigil, y'all, please come out. We're out there at the corner of Person and Jones. Daniel's out there right now, 200 East Jones Street or 298 East Jones Street. At the corner of Jones and Persons from 11 a.m. to 4 p.m. I am on my way back to the vigil and we'll see you out there tomorrow if you come. Thanks, everybody.
We had one more question we can throw in there with the last 2 minutes we have from Peter again. If there are 3 purposes of incarceration, they might be retribution, parentheses, punishment, rehabilitation, and restitution. Do we have access to information as to how much is being spent at the state or county level for each of these? Is there a balance today? What should the balance be? And what is success and how is it measured?
So we do, let me just say, in general, data coming from jails and prisons is very difficult to access. So because jails, each county has its own system, they report a different way, they're not required to report to one another. And then the state has its own way of reporting, and access to that can be a little cumbersome. And then the way they source out their data. So we don't always have exact numbers and about what's happening. And then they always like to say that, that is confidential information as well, people's status within a prison due to safety and security. So oftentimes what happens is we don't get a lot of information because they'll say that it's sensitive information. And so I know that those are the barriers to reliable, good data here in the state of North Carolina. Craig, do you have any? I know you have some research. Maybe y'all have something at Disability Rights that I'm not aware of.
I don't have anything right off the top. I'd have to dig.
All right, everyone. Thank you so much. We will see you Tuesday. Thank you for everyone.
Thanks for a lit conversation.
And Andrew and Erika, again, thank y'all so much. We really appreciate it.
Absolutely, Grandma. That's a great comment.
Love you.
Everyone be well. Peace.